Hi, my name is Heath Jones, and I'm the pastor of Northwood Christian Church and also the host of the Northwood podcast, which leads me to the first thing I want to say. I'm recording this for two audiences. One is our usual Facebook and YouTube audience, but the other audience that I mentioned briefly last time is our podcast audience. You may not know this, but Northwood has a podcast called The Northwood Podcast, creatively named. And it's made available by way of Wish TV here in Indianapolis, Channel 8. You can look on their website and read about the other podcasts they produce by way of All Indiana Podcast Network, which they host, and you should check it out on Wish TV's website, which you can find at www.wishtv.com/podcast, and you can see the link in the description below. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about our church, I encourage you to visit our website at www.indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. And there you can learn how to get involved in the life-giving work that we are doing here at Northwood. Or if you'd like to support us monetarily, there are giving links on our website as well as information for our service times and other things that you might wish to know. If you are listening by way of the podcast, we'll take this moment to pause for some advertisements. But if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, let's just get straight to it. And I'll apologize up front for some of the background noise. There are some children playing basketball right outside my church office, and I don't want to ask them to stop because they're having a great time. So if you hear that in the background, that's what it is, and I apologize. So without further ado, let's turn to the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be going over verses 10 through 17, and it goes. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Before we dive in, I want to place in the foreground of this discussion what it is that we are trying to do here. And by we, I mean the church, and more specifically, for our purposes, I mean my church, the one I pastor, Northwood Christian Church. What are we trying to do here? Well, what we are trying to do here, as best as we can, is to understand God's purposes, which we believe are to restore what is broken in the world and in humanity. Then we hope to become a part of this life-giving work, to restore what can be repaired and healed. In so doing, we hope to be a conduit for God's love, a channel by which the people around us come into contact with God's life-giving Spirit. We hope that when people come to church, they sense that God's love is coursing through our community, and that what they find here is precisely what they need. We hope they find comfort and rest. We hope they find relief from anxiety and a hope for the future. And these are the things that we hope Northwood brings to the world, and other things besides. In short, We hope that we can be a place that brings the healing presence of Jesus near to the people. In our story today, Jesus is all of these things that we hope to be at Northwood and more. He's a healer. He restores those around him. He reflects the values of God. In fact, he embodies God's purposes. And the people, sensing these things, gather from all around the countryside just to be near him. What the woman in today's story is looking for, she finds in Jesus. She comes to Jesus bent over. She has been bent over for 18 years, nearly 2 decades, and then now she is restored. She finds what she came there looking for, in fact, probably more. Now let's skip over the part in the middle where the religious leader in the community confronts Jesus in an adversarial way and tries to stir things up amidst the crowd. And if you take out that middle part and just gauge the reaction of the people, the crowd that is standing by, watching it all, what you have is the following sequence of events. 1, Jesus is teaching. 2, a woman with a bent back approaches Jesus for healing. 3, she is healed. 4, the woman rejoices. She is over the moon because she has been healed, and who can blame her? 5, then if we skip over that part where Jesus has this interaction with the religious leader, if we skip over, then 5, the crowd goes wild. Or the text reads, quoting, the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. The woman needs healing. Woman is healed. She is restored to her community. The community rejoices. They are jubilant. That's the gist. And the point I'm wanting to make in passing is this. The people are eager to experience healing. People then and now naturally seek out places where they experience restoration and joy. In today's story, the people seek out Jesus because when they draw near to him, they experience restoration and joy. You with me? So it follows that if our churches were places where people experienced restoration and joy in similar fashion, then they would come to our churches in droves. If our churches were places where the masses of people knew they could share an experience that made their lives better, then they would be in our churches. They would respond, as the crowd does in today's story, to our work, rejoicing at the wonderful things we are doing. But alas, they are not coming in droves to our churches, and they are not rejoicing. So let's go back to the middle part of our story. Enter established religion. In today's story, the leader of the religious community steps in to give some order to the proceedings, let's say. And one can imagine him as a modern pastor responding to a complaint about how someone is dressed in church or about the language used by some guest or visitor. And sure, the purpose of their religion is ostensibly to bring healing, but hey, we've got to follow the procedures. Enter protocol, enter entrenched rituals, enter manners and sensibilities, the right way to do things. The text reads that the leader of the religious community was indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath. Them's fighting words. He's angry. And he defines what Jesus did as work. That's how he gets to his anger, which was not allowed on the Sabbath. But I do not think that the point here is the rule. In my experience, when someone tries to pin another person down on a technicality, the broken rule is often not really the point. The point is often the barrier. The religious ruler is placing a barrier between the people and God's healing work, for whatever reason. Now, before you jump on his case, I ask you, do you think he's unique? And of course, he isn't. Religious people are notorious for putting up barriers between God and the people. Paywalls, who's in and who's out, who can take communion, or digitally speaking, on the online world, subscribe to our channel or buy our book, then you can have access to God. Or If the barriers aren't financial, the religious community might put up walls of another kind. Doctrinal and moral purity codes, rules meant to regulate and determine who is holy enough to belong in the community of the holy God. Or, if we will not hand them that list, we hope that they will learn the rules by inference and experience as they come to our church on Sunday mornings to gratify us. The rules can give the community grounds for condemning the rule breaker if they will not or cannot conform. Or perhaps the community is simply kind and polite, practicing that Sunday morning patience with them while we wait for them to learn how to toe the line. The rules could be about doctrine, the community's beliefs about God, but it's just as likely that the rules could be those unspoken, unwritten codes about how to dress, or what words to use or not to use, or even where to sit in church. It's as if the woman in our story may walk into our churches, and the first thing we do to her is to tell her to duck. The woman who's already bent over, stooping, cannot stand up straight, we say, keep your head down, follow the rules, sit here, now stand up and say this, think this way. In the meantime, those that can't stand straight, those who are burdened by the trials and pressures of this world find no relief. While we're bickering and imposing our rules, people who can't stand straight find no relief. We are so good at finding reasons to keep those shouldering burdens on the outside. Keeping churches segregated racially was justified by quoting verses from the Bible. Keeping gay people out still is. Keeping women from full inclusion in church leadership is justified by appeals to traditions and scripture. But there are other factors that negatively impact our inclusion in our churches as well. Classism, narrow-minded interpretations of the faith. We'll find our reasons. You could make a list. I could make a list. Humans always make a list. Some rules about who's in and who's out. The religious authority in our story tries to pull Jesus back into the world he inhabits. A safe place where we know who belongs and where they should stand. One of order and control. One that certainly doesn't include this bent-over woman. And while we're at it, he could have selected any reason from a long list of reasons to exclude this woman. Her crippled status certainly set her apart. Probably there were rules regarding her infirmity that might assign her the designation of unclean under certain interpretations. Or if not, perhaps her status as a woman, simply that, could do. She is, after all, unaccompanied in a public place. She should be accompanied by a male member of her family, as is required by law. I wonder why she's alone, perhaps the religious leader might think. Has she committed adultery, some other sin? A list of reasons he could have made. But the religious leader decides instead to take issue with Jesus. Perhaps the woman's situation was so pitiable that ganging up on her would be bad form. And judging by the crowd's reaction at her healing, I'd say that she must have been valued by the community. They are happy that she is restored. Either way, he goes after Jesus and tries to make the case that Jesus has violated the Sabbath. And Jesus isn't having any of it. He cuts to the chase. This isn't about the Sabbath. If it were, the rules would be applied consistently. And Jesus points to the long-established practice of leading a donkey to water on the Sabbath if necessary. If your animal is thirsty, your livestock, wouldn't you lead it to life even if this meant bending the rules? After all, aren't the rules about life in the end? About what cultivates the most life in the community? I mean, what good are the rules if they keep us from living well? In fact, provisions were made in the law that allowed for such circumstances, and Jesus points to these because the point of the rules is to cultivate the best environment for life. So what gives? Well, the significance of this story would grow as the early followers of Jesus would make concessions to include new Gentile converts who were previously excluded from Jesus' community. In the end, I think this is a discussion about what rules we keep in order to facilitate the most life and the most inclusion in the community. And The original Jesus followers were nearly entirely Jewish, but as Gentiles converted to the faith, questions arose. Should these newcomers acquiesce to the letter of their laws, such as laws about dietary restrictions or about how to pray, or should the men be circumcised, or should they keep the Sabbath, as the religious leader in today's text seems to think Jesus should be keeping? And the early Jewish Jesus followers found ways of including these rule breakers, and in the name of God's love. They recognized that Gentiles too were metaphorically bent over, unable to stand straight, and in need of God's healing presence. So, all barriers between the people and God's love must be removed, and the early church found ways of removing these barriers. And in response to this conviction, the early Christians adapted and reframed their perspective. They even called into question long-established norms and practices, some of them centuries old and encoded in the scriptures. And they did this so that these newcomers would find their place and be able to finally stand up straight for once in their lives. And here's what we know. There are many today who can't stand straight. Perhaps their dignity has been taken from them as they've been exploited by our modern economic systems. Perhaps they've been degraded throughout the course of these past decades by classism, sexism, racism, homophobia, or any other of the toxic cultural forces at play. There are countless people looking for healing and restoration. Or as Jesus put it, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. But here's the thing. If people sensed that they could find relief in our churches, they would be here with us. But many have learned through experience that churches are not places where they may find relief from their burdens. In fact, churches have done much to increase their burdens as the classism, sexism, racism, and homophobia of our culture has been embedded in our communities of faith, and as we've done little to condemn the rampant greed and consumerism of our time. In fact, the church in North America has in many ways become enamored by our consumer culture and its values. And so, like the woman looking for healing, people looking for healing, they do not sense healing and a wholesome presence in the church. And in the meantime, there are many who cannot stand straight. In our story today, one woman found relief and was made to stand straight. She met Jesus, the conduit for God's love and power. Then she was able to reclaim her worth, her dignity, and her place in her community. And in response, she rejoiced, but so did her community at large. Or as I put it earlier, the crowd went wild in response to what Jesus was doing, and they may well do so again. Because we live in a culture and during a time when people, broadly speaking, are eager to find a place like this that helps people stand up and walk a little straighter, a place where they can find healing. And I'll say again the words I spoke from the beginning of this talk. I began by describing Northwood's intentions. May we live into these intentions. I said, what we are trying to do here, as best as we can, is to understand God's purposes, which we believe are to restore what is broken in the world and in humanity. Then we hope to become a part of this life-giving work to restore what can be repaired and healed. In so doing, we hope to be a conduit for God's love, a channel by which the people around us come into contact with God's life-giving Spirit. We hope that when people come to church, they sense that God's love is coursing through our community and that what they find here is precisely what they need. We hope they find comfort and rest. We hope they find relief from anxiety and a hope for the future. These are the things we hope Northwood brings to the world and other things. In short, we hope that we can be a place that brings the healing presence of Jesus near to the people. It is time for us to live into this vision, and for Christians all throughout the land, to live into this vision. This is our calling as followers of Jesus. We have been equipped and empowered by God to be this healing presence in the world. We have God's Spirit in us to be this. Any barriers we've placed between God and the people, we must examine and remove. We must meet those who cannot stand straight, metaphorically or literally, precisely where they are, and break down the barriers that have kept them away. How if the church lived into this vision? In the meantime, we must repent of our own prejudices and engage our beliefs and faith claims with humility and openness. The world is longing for a place that channels the healing presence of Jesus. They'll know they have found it by the healing they experience in that place when they find it. We will know that we are that place when we observe others finding healing in our community and because of our faithful efforts. We'll know it when we see it around us, when people will join with the woman in today's story and rejoice because of what they've found here through us by God's grace. The crowd, her community, our community will notice, and their response will be much the same as the crowd in today's story in response to the life they discovered in Jesus. Or to quote the text, when he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. This pastor believes, it is my conviction that this can happen here. And I hope that it continues to happen here.